I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we're joined by Roland Oliphant, senior foreign correspondent at the Telegraph, who calls us from the Donbass, where he's been reporting on the Russian offensive in the region. We also discuss Russia's looming default and get the latest on the economic blockade of Ukraine.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 26th of May, day 92. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's defence and security editor, Nicholls, economics reporter Louis Ashworth, and Roland Oliphant, who's on the ground in the Donbass. I started by asking Roland for the latest from the east, where Ukrainian fighters are outnumbered and stretched by a determined Russian attack.
So I'm in the Donbass, which, as I'm sure everybody knows by now, is a coal-producing area of East Ukraine that straddles the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and is where the Russians are putting in their big battle of encirclement. What have I seen? The Russians are making progress, and you can audibly hear the Ukrainian defenses creaking at the moment, and in some places, frankly, kind of breaking. So there's two main areas of operation. There's Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which is right at the eastern point of the salient. And there's a very narrow neck of land still connecting that to the rest of Ukrainian territory. The Russians are pushing to cut the road. They apparently, I think the day before yesterday, they got some units onto that road, and they were able to briefly set up checkpoints before they were pushed back. And that's a real worry for the Ukrainians, because you're facing a really difficult situation. It's either stay and fight and end up in an encirclement like Mariupol, or it's try and pull back. And frankly, I mean, the road is covered by artillery. It's a very scary place to be at the foot of that road, quite honestly. So any attempt to pull back is going to come into trouble. They're also pushing further in. If you imagine this salient, further out, there's two other prongs. One to the south, a place called Svetlodarsk. So the Ukrainians pulled back from there, and the Russians moved into it and are now pushing onto the next town up the road. And they're also pushing south into a place called Liman. And I was quite near Liman yesterday. Really heavy artillery battle going on, and you can see. If you stand up on the ridges, you can see for miles the front line is kind of defined by rising smoke from these artillery barrages. The Russians are meant to have they're in Liman, they're in part of Liman, they're likely to take it quite soon. And that is closing another jaw of this salient. If you think of a wolf's mouth towards the end, there's two more teeth coming in. And both of those thrusts kind of look like they're directed towards the town of Bakhmut, which is the main logistics center. It's the end of the road of life to Severodonetsk. So Bakhmut, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, these are going to be the next battlegrounds, depending on how far this offensive goes. But yeah, I mean, the shelling is audible almost anywhere in this in this landscape, in this salient.
And when you're speaking to Ukrainian civilians and soldiers, what do they tell you? What's the mood like there?
Everyone's different. I mean, some people are quite frank about how frightened they are. I mean, I was talking to a guy in a Ukrainian mortar platoon, not exactly on this front, a bit further up towards Izum the other day, and he said, "Look, I've literally shat myself many times." He said, "Everyone is terrified. It is just horrible because it's this artillery war, and you're just locked down. You can't move. You can't raise your head. It's just shells coming in, bang, bang, bang." He was talking about lying there pissing in a bottle because you can't move. You can't go outside while this is going on. So that's kind of physically terrifying. there is this sense, do you remember a couple of weeks ago, people were talking about, well, the great Ukrainian counteroffensive is coming. There is a sense the Russians have the initiative now. So I think there's definitely a sense of nervousness around here. I mean, for civilians, it's such a strange mix. I mean, there's people, by now, the people who are still here are often people who either can't leave because they feel they haven't got any money, they haven't got anywhere to go, they've got relatives to look after, or they just don't want to leave because, they can't really imagine something bad happening to them. And so, it's, I spoke to a woman whose, it was her daughter's apartment was blown up by a Russian airstrike. Which I think had probably missed some military target in the town. It took out this entire block of flats. Miraculously, no one was killed. And she'd just been visiting her daughter's apartment to check on it, because her daughter's already evacuated, make sure the gas is off, all that kind of thing. She left, and straight away she hears this big bang. She thinks, oh, another shell's gone off somewhere in town. Goes around the corner. The big bang was the flat she just left, getting blown to bits. And she's still not leaving. Her and her husband were collecting all the furniture and taking it over to their own house, but quite fatalistic. What will be will be. So it's a real mix. It's a strange kind of thing. And the more the shelling goes on, of course, the more people get used to it. Right, it becomes like the weather. There's a degree to which people become accustomed to loud bangs going on nearby. Weirdly.
I'm sure Dom and Louis have some questions, but just one final one from me. What would it mean for the Ukrainians to lose this battle, and what would it mean for the Russians to win?
I think for the Russians, it's quite politically important. So, Vladimir Putin has publicly stated his goal as the liberation of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. If they win Severodonetsk, Severodonetsk, I'm getting the town mixed up, and Lysychansk, that is the last kind of toenail of Ukrainian territory in Luhansk. So they will then claim, we have liberated the Luhansk People's Republic. But that's only a partial victory. Next on the list is the Donetsk People's Republic. So politically important for the Russians, important in morale terms for the Ukrainians as well. The Ukrainians they're currently basically trading space for time, I think. They're kind of pulling back, but how long can you do that? And although the Ukrainians have that advantage, they can retreat and try to inflict as much attrition on the Russians as possible as they go. How far can you retreat? And if there's another encirclement and another kind of Mariupol, in Severodonetsk, what is that going to do to public morale? How many soldiers are going to be lost in this battle? Is it going to affect Ukraine's ability to operate and fight? I think that was the Russian objective at the beginning. And the truth is we don't really know, because we don't really know exactly how many men and how much equipment both sides are losing.
Well, thanks, Roland. Dom and Louis, do you have any questions for Roland, having listened to that?
Yes, please. Hi, Roland. Good to hear from you, mate. Can you give us an idea about the geography there? So if this pocket is closed by Russia, are there natural geographic features that means they will stop? Rivers, mountains, what have you, or is it largely flat and they're able to push west? I'm just trying to get an idea of how much further they might be able to exploit any success they're having.
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question, because I'm literally writing a dispatch that is very heavy on landscape.
That wasn't planned, I can assure listeners.
No, it's perfect. And I'm doing another one. There's two elements of landscape, and I'm doing one now and one next week. So on the general aspect of the landscape, so there is, I think you sometimes hear people talk about the steep. We're out on the steep and it's all very open, and you might get this impression that it's kind of, snooker board flat prairie or something. It's not. It's this it's kind of big wide rolling valleys that is quite open. It's heavily agricultural, so almost everything is sown, and between the fields you've got long lines of trees, which are very verdant, very lush in spring. Down in these broad valleys you've got villages, rivers, lakes, towns, things like that. So that it is much more open than up north in the Battle of Kiev and so on. But it's I think there was an analysis I saw on Twitter which confirmed what I thought, which is that the Russians are making the most progress up on those ridges, up on the high ground, right? Because it's easier. Otherwise, you get bogged down in urban combat. lower down. So this breakout they've had from Popasna is up on those ridges. But the main feature that I think is emerging, and has already emerged as kind of the main feature of the battle, is the Siversky Donets River, which, if you look on the map, I mean, it's quite long. It's a tributary of the Don, of Rostov-on-Don over in Russia, and it comes all the way down through Kharkiv region, and it kind of is becoming to define this whole battlefield. So you remember we were talking about the counteroffensive around Kharkiv, right, the other week, and the Ukrainians pushed out east, right? And they had one offensive north of the border and the other one east. And the offensive north of the border stopped at the border, and the one of the east that reached the banks of the Siversky Donets, because that's the natural kind of barrier. And further south, downstream, there's Severodonetsk, which is on the east/northern bank, which the Russians are trying to surround. We've seen all this talk about. Remember these battles? Was it 2 weeks? How long ago was it? The pontoon bridges, this disaster.
Crikey, yeah, 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah, trying to get across the river.
Right, it's that river.
Group wiped out.
Exactly, it's the Siversky Donetsk River, and it's taken the Russians so long because they've struggled to get across, and the Ukrainians have made a point of bringing their artillery to bear every time the Russians try to cross. And just kind of closer to where I am, we're talking about the Battle of Liman. Liman is just on that northern side. I think that river, it's difficult to get across. It's quite wide. It's not that deep or well dredged, but it's wide and wild. And I think that is emerging. If we end up in a stalemate, I think that is going to emerge as a kind of natural front line separating the two.
So they're not yet over that river. So even if they're able to bypass Severodonetsk to the south, so if they push west from Popasna, they're still not over that river. Is that what you're saying?
No. So they're not over the river to the north. So they tried to come over on the northern side of the salient, kind of west of Severodonetsk, and that's where they got screwed up, kind of 3 times, destroyed. And after that failure, we got this breakthrough out of Popasna. Now Popasna is on the west bank of that river. So on the southern flank, they've already crossed that river, which I think is why we're seeing a bit more success for the Russians in moving from that direction than the encirclement attempt from the north.
Thanks. And is there any feel as to why Ukraine was able to knit together these small local counterattacks into a broader counteroffensive to the north and the northeast of Kharkiv, and not similar behaviour here? Is it just the sheer weight of numbers from Russia, and as we've written today, that they're finally getting the combined arms manoeuvre together? But are they 2 different fights, basically?
I think so. I mean, Kharkiv, I think one of the advantages the Ukrainians had at Kharkiv is that the Russians had pulled out a lot of men to concentrate on this Donbass fight. And so the Ukrainians were able to kind of concentrate their forces and achieve local superiority. And it was the Russians who were forced to kind of retreat because they couldn't adequately respond. And down here, I mean, you had, was it yesterday? An advisor to President Zelensky basically admitting, look, there's parts of the Donbass front where we are outnumbered 7-1, right? And you had the governor of Luhansk region, what's left of Luhansk region. He doesn't even have an office anymore. He's working out of a van. He's talking about, quote, insane numbers, unquote, of Russian troops being deployed here. So I think there's just too many of them. And I think the Ukrainians they're in trouble because the Russians, it's not just Severodonetsk, right? It's also around Popasna, it's also around Svitlodarsk, it's also around Liman. So there's kind of, 3 or 4 axes they're having to respond to kind of prevent breakthroughs. So, they're struggling basically to contain this.
Roland, we hear a lot about the weapons and the equipment being sent to the Ukrainian army from the west. Do you have much of a sense of that on the ground? What kind of things are they using? Are they getting through?
I don't know. I mean, I saw some Ukrainian artillery up close the other day, but it was old, I think 122mm self-propelled howitzers, Soviet ones. Don probably remembers the name, the Gvozda or something, I think they said. I saw a mortar, quite large caliber. I don't know if that was 122 or something. And this is Dom stuff, right? The mortar platoon did have foreign stuff. They were very pleased. They had, I think it was Italian and Czech or Polish mortar shells, and they were extremely pleased with how quick it was compared to the other stuff to kind of get it out, put the fuse on it, and bang, you just drop it in and it's ready to go. And they said they were very pleased with that, or the guy I spoke to was very pleased with that. But these M77 howitzers and all of this, I don't know. I haven't personally clapped eyes on any of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the impression I'm getting talking to folk is, firstly, every little bit helps. I mean, they're delighted to receive any of this, and as the natures of the equipment have been getting bigger and heavier, so the M777s are big 155mm howitzers with a range, in excess of 30 kilometres. Then these are the kind of the natures of the weapons they need to push back. In the last couple of days, the Ukrainians up to President Zelensky, up to and including President Zelensky, have been calling for MLRS, so the multiple launch rocket systems. So these are the really big, very, very long range rocket systems, usually self-propelled, which means that they are tracked on a sort of tank chassis, so they can get into action and just as importantly, away from the location very quickly after firing. If the Russians, as we know, same with the Ukrainians, have counter battery radars. So what that means is they've got radars that can see incoming artillery shells, and they just do the maths, work out the physics to work out where that thing was launched from, and then if that radar is linked as it should be to an artillery battery itself, then they can fire back very, very quickly to the originating point. So self-propelled artillery is hugely it's almost an act of survival nowadays. The M777s, actually, the Americans have donated, are not self-propelled. They are towed by other trucks, so they are very, very capable, but somewhat limited in that they are not as mobile. But mortar tubes are slightly more mobile because they're much smaller. They can just be sort of humped around and chucked on trucks and what have you. Commensurately smaller caliber generally, but I mean, even mortar rounds are equally devastatingly effective. So yeah, I'm not surprised that all the different natures of ammunition, which might on the one hand prove as a headache for any logistician trying to carry all this stuff forward and make sure the right ammunition gets to the right place, it is all very welcome by Ukraine. I just worry, Roland, I mean, so we were just talking about geography then a little while ago. So in terms of the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, the borders of those oblasts, is that a geographic feature? There's talk of if Russia takes the whole of the Donbass, so those two oblasts, is there likely to be a natural pause there, possibly because the Russian forces will be exhausted? And is there a natural geographic feature that they could rest up on, and then the world will see if this claim by Putin that it was actually the Donbass all along that he was after, if there was any truth in that?
I mean, the short answer is I don't really think there are. I mean, a bit of local history. Donbass means Donetsk basin, but it's talking about the coal basin. But that's an underground geological feature. I mean, the Donbass is basically on a kind of ridge, but it's one you don't really notice when you're going up it because it's not a huge thing. It has got these valleys, but we're talking very broad rolling landscape, not anything else. The road between Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Dnipro. I mean, it's similar kind of country. In fact, some of it's a lot flatter than it is around here. So my short answer is no, I don't think there is a natural geographic feature. The natural geographic feature is the Dnieper River, right? Which we thought at the beginning which probably was the Russian objective, right? And the southern Russian line is anchored on the Dnipro, a place called Vasilivka, just south of Zaporizhia. But then the front kind of winds across the steppe, along these roads. So, I mean, a natural start. It'll be a political decision to stop. I don't think it's the geography that's going to do it, to be honest.
Yeah, I just wonder if the forces are tired after all this heavy fighting, even though they might have open rolling countryside in front of them. They might just be limited by their own their own stocks of fuel and all the rest of it, and lack of sleep for the fighters. So I just wonder if they were going to try and move into a defensive position. But I guess we'll find out. It sounds like we'll find out in the next few days. Has the town of Lyman, I think that's on the river as well, has that fallen yet?
Yeah, so that's the town. I was kind of within about 5k of that yesterday, on a little place on the river. I went to a little place on the river because I wanted to do a thing about the river, and I thought it would be a quiet spot, and it wasn't really. It was, I think, Liman today. The latest I understand is that the Russians have about half the town. They're already doing house-to-house searches of people's flats, looking for stay-behind Ukrainians. It's going to fall, I think, in the next. I'm not sure what the latest is from there today. But the fighting there is very intense. The artillery barrages are heavy, so it will go quite soon. And it's in the river valley. It's not right on the bank of the river, but it is. There's a kind of low-lying national park of wetlands around the river there, and Liman is just, I don't know, a mile from the bank or something around there. So basically that would bring them very close to the northern stroke eastern bank, in that area near Slavyansk.
Just one more question from me, Roland, and thank you so much for your time. How do you see this battle for the Donbass evolving and changing over the next few days? What are the big flashpoints that our listeners should be looking for?
I mean, the big flashpoint, it's Siversky Donetsk, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. That pocket right at the end, that's the big dramatic thing. And that's where the Russians are really putting the net effort and most pressure to close. But they are also, you want to watch Liman and you want to watch, Svetogorsk stroke Lukhanskoye down south of Bakhmut, because those two fangs are, they are threatening to get in further deeper into the salient. Further along, and especially this thing at Liman. I mean, if you got Liman, you can threaten a place called Siversk, which is probably your only other alternative in and out of Severodonetsk. So those 3 points are the main things to keep an eye on, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Roland. Obviously, more than welcome to stay and listen to the rest of the chat and contribute where you would like. Can we just zoom out from Donbass? Louis and Dom, what are the other updates from Ukraine and around the world that we should be aware of today?
So the World Economic Forum is still rumbling on in Davos, and it was at the forum a couple of days ago. You'll remember Henry Kissinger, the veteran US statesman, made those comments about Ukraine will need to cede territory for peace, lest there'll be any sort of increase in tension, and the comments didn't go down well in Ukraine, as you might imagine. So President Zelensky in his Wednesday night, or in his nightly address last night, was talking about this, and he said a quote. He said, "No matter what the Russian state does, there's always someone who says let's take its interests into account." He carried on. He said, "It seems that Mr. Kissinger's calendar is not 2022 but 1938, and he thought he was talking to an audience not in Davos but in Munich at the time." And he's just saying that this is appeasement in the modern world, and it should be resisted. The idea, he was suggesting that Kissinger's comments were just a little bit old, a little bit 20th century, a little bit clunky, just had run out of speed, and they might have been appropriate for his time and of his time, but not now. And President Zelensky referred to Kissinger's family history. I mean, Kissinger had to flee Nazi Germany as a child, and President Zelensky said he was 15 years old and he understood everything perfectly. Nobody heard from him then that it was necessary to adapt to the Nazis instead of fleeing them or fighting them. So a very powerful rebuttal of Kissinger's comments there from President Zelensky, just having absolutely no truck with this idea that there's a territory should be negotiated for peace. And just finally on Davos, so Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, has been speaking today, and he from the forum, and he said that Putin's not going to be able. He said Putin can't dictate the peace, and said that he'd already failed in all his strategic aims. And a quote here from Olaf Scholz: "Our goal is crystal clear. Putin must not win this war, and I'm content that he will not win it." So, yeah, pretty strong from Olaf Scholz. Again, needs to be backed up by actions. Germany has been, mild criticism for the last few weeks for their support for Ukraine. But no, Scholz pretty punchy there in Davos today.
Thanks, Tom. Louis Ashworth, our economics reporter, can we turn to you? You've written an interesting piece that makes the case that Moscow is on the cusp of its first foreign debt default in a century after the US allowed an exemption permitting Russia to meet its obligations to international creditors to lapse. For those of us who are not economics reporters, can you explain this? What's going on?
Hi, David, and yeah, thanks for having me on again. I feel like with this default stuff, I'm sort of like a commentator in a tortoise race or something like that because of how slowly these pieces are moving. When I've come on before, I've spoken about this idea of a sort of engineered Russian default. So what we're looking at here is the idea that Russia may fail to make payments on its foreign debt for the first time in about a century. So the last time it failed to do so was in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, when the Bolsheviks basically repudiated all the Tsar's debts and said, we won't pay these. Fast forward 100 years ish, and we're in a similar situation again. But a lot of things are quite different. What's basically happening here is rather than Russia refusing to pay its debts, the United States is effectively making it impossible. So early on in the conflict, when the West was first unleashing a sort of set of sanctions against Russia, one of the things they did was introduce this exemption that allowed bond payments to continue. So the people who had lent money to Russia could still receive repayments from Russia for that lending. That exemption was due to lapse on Wednesday morning, and there was a lot of questions over whether the US would go ahead with allowing it to lapse. There are arguments in both directions. So the argument in favor of it is that engineering a default, which is what would effectively happen by not extending the exemption, would be catastrophic for Russia's reputation as an international borrower. It would have long-term repercussions for Russian corporate borrowing. It would have very symbolic effects. And then the arguments in favor of extending the exemption further were largely that Russia was being forced in order to make these payments to tap into its limited foreign exchange reserves. So there were arguments both ways. We saw on Wednesday that the US has gone with the option of not extending the exemption, which means that effectively as of first thing Wednesday, sort of 5 o'clock in the morning London time on Wednesday, it's no longer possible for Russia's central bank, its finance ministry, and major lenders to make payments to Western or to US based bondholders. And what this basically means is a default is inevitable, because there will come a time at which Russia has to make payments, probably some sort of coupon payment on a debt that it simply won't be able to. It'll be, the computer says no type situation. Realistically, it'll be they'll try and send money to a US bank, someone like Citigroup or someone like that, and it simply won't be allowed because of the restrictions in place. So it will then enter a grace period, which will be 30 days. There will be no option during those 30 days to pay in any other way, try as Moscow might, and then it will default. When that happens exactly remains a slightly open question. So we got near to this before in April when we thought Russia was going to fail to make payments. And then in the last moment it did, tapping its reserves. Russia has payments due on 3 euro bonds, which are dollar-denominated bonds, tomorrow. It's possible that those may be the kindling for the default fire that's going to slowly sort of begin over the coming month. But a lot of those bonds are held not by US investors, but by investors in Europe and elsewhere in the world, which creates a kind of weird situation because they may well still receive their payments. And in that case, Russia won't default a month from now. Instead, what will happen is we'll have the next tranche of payments, which is June the 23rd. And then there'll be no ability for Russia to make those payments, presuming things haven't changed between now and then. And then there'll be another 30-day grace period. And then Russia will default in late July. So it's a bit of a weird situation, and it feels all a little bit academic because effectively the damage is kind of there. But as I've discussed before, there are real significances to a Russian default in terms of it ties the hands of a lot of Western investors in terms of whether they're able to lend money to Russia, and more significantly for Russia's economy, it may dictate whether some investors can lend money to Russian businesses who are much more reliant on the international market for funds. So there are some real effects from this. It is almost certainly going to happen, but it might still be a couple of months from now.
Thanks, Louis. That was incredibly comprehensive. Would you like to comment on the ongoing story of the food crisis caused by the Russian blockade in Ukraine? The Kremlin has said that the West only has itself to blame for this. Why do they say that? What's going on? What's the latest there?
Look, I think this is a question that sort of lands in between the three of us here in some ways. I mean, speaking on the economic side, we've obviously seen the huge amount of disruption to global food supply that has occurred both directly as a result of food products not being able to leave Ukraine, but also the knock-on effects that's had around the world. India, we discussed last week, had introduced an export ban on wheat, which took some wheat supply out of the global market. It's now doing the same with sugar as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see similar actions taking place in foreign countries. Sorry, by which I mean sort of foreign countries foreign to Ukraine and Russia, because it's quite an easy populist move for a government to do if it's facing a domestic food inflation crisis, to say, we produce this food, its price is going up, we're going to stop exporting it and attempt to sort of control our market, make sure supplies are here, and make sure that we put our own people first in terms of who's getting food. So we've spoken before about that effect. This has come up a lot with Ukraine because although a lot of Ukrainian production infrastructure has effectively been taken out of action by the conflict, either it's been destroyed intentionally or unintentionally as a result of the conflict. It's been rendered inaccessible because of where the front lines have been drawn. For various reasons, production has been disrupted at the source, but also Ukraine has not been able to get its food products out of the country because of the Russian blockade towards sort of the major Black Sea route that you would take to ship out of Ukraine. We're seeing now this indication from Russia that it would be willing to create naval corridors. This comes a few days after actually Zelensky speaking at Davos said that Ukraine was in talks with some of the Baltic countries, so Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, about the prospect of utilizing their naval routes, so sending some products up by land into the Baltic states and then shipping it out from there. I'm not sure if this is exactly a reaction to that. I think this is a reaction to a sort of a broader criticism of Moscow that's become very elevated in recent days over its blockade. It's difficult to say. Clearly, this is Putin trying to go for an element of a propaganda win because it makes him look like more of a humanitarian if he says we're willing to open up these corridors and let this food out. I think the practicalities are somewhat more difficult, and I think it's a more cynical move than it looks. And this may be an area where Roland and Dom can come in much more productively, but it's not as simple as simply opening a corridor, because you then have to also send ships in and out of that corridor, and you have to trust that they're not going to be interfered with. And that is an area where we've seen the Netherlands has suggested that it would be willing to support some vessels leaving ports to the Black Sea. It's a very difficult thing to do practically, because you are putting what would be NATO vessels very close to Russian vessels, and I think it's a very high risk situation. I mean, it may be better, NATO may consider, to leave it as effectively neutralized than to turn it into a tinderbox.
Thanks, Louis. As you said, let's bring in Roland and Dom for some comment and analysis on that. Dom, would you like to go first?
Yes, this idea of effectively breaking the naval blockade of the Black Sea. This came up in a conversation on Monday, I think it was. Had a background briefing from Western officials, and we asked this very question: what would it take? This was on the back of the the suggestion from Lithuania's foreign minister that there should be a coalition of the willing, somewhat loaded term, but a coalition of the willing to try and break this naval blockade. The Lithuanian foreign minister apparently raised it with Liz Truss, and that's where she didn't shoot the idea down. So I think this was where the idea came from that Britain might supply, the Royal Navy might break the blockade. I mean, that ain't going to happen, quite frankly. I mean, definitely isn't going to happen. But this idea that you might try and get through the blockade was raised with the Western officials, and they said, look, at the moment, anything that happens in that part of the Black Sea has to have the permission of Russia. Now, Russia, as we've seen from Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry, he said, yeah, well, that's entirely possible as soon as you lay off on the sanctions. So it's going nowhere at the moment, this idea. There are other routes to try and get goods and the food out. Rail and road, it's possible, but they are much less efficient than coming out by sea. So at the moment, it's going nowhere really, and this idea of a naval blockade or breaking the naval blockade just simply isn't possible. It needs Russia's. I hate to use the term permission, but that's effectively what it is. They can strike. They can strike what they want, merchant shipping wise, in that area. They would probably claim that they'd hit a Ukrainian mine to divert blame. But at the moment, the desire is there, but any practical solutions are just going nowhere.
And Roland, what's the view from Ukraine on this?
I'm not really sure, to be honest, because I've just been thinking about kind of shells flying around. But I'm curious about what the Russians have actually said. Like, how does this blockade actually operate? Have they actually said? Maybe you guys know this. It's a question that's been nagging. Have they actually said we are going to sink any ship that tries and runs into Odessa, or not? Or is it just their presence and the implicit threat that causes third country flagged merchantmen not to take the risk? And isn't it?
It's the latter. It's the implied threat, the implicit threat. I mean, Russia on the one hand, they come out and say we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and we're the greatest, and everyone looks at them and goes, "Come on, mate, you're rolling out T-62s from your reserve stocks, for God's sake." But then on the other hand, they do a lot of stuff implicitly. Like that comment I just made from Dmitry Peskov, saying, of course, it's entirely possible to negotiate safe passage for maritime traffic as soon as the NATO and Western-inspired sanctions are lifted. I mean, there's the implied threat in there. So there is not this blockade. It's not sort of ships in a long line physically barring anyone from moving in the North Sea. In the Black Sea. It doesn't have to be like that. It is entirely possible to threaten from Crimea and air-launched munitions that might come from mainland Russia. So they don't physically have to have ships lined up and submarines surfacing and then going away again, etc., etc., for the threat to be known. And of course, you don't need a huge amount of threat here for insurance companies to say, well, we're not going to take the risk, we're not going to insure that maritime vessel, and for the companies and the skippers on those ships to think it's just not worth the risk. I mean, we have seen this happen. There have been early on in the war, weeks ago, merchant shipping was sunk. Now, we don't know. At the time, it was suggested that they'd hit mines in the northwest portion of the Black Sea, but we don't know. But it is entirely feasible to reach these areas without having to have a very large naval presence. And of course, Russia doesn't want to have a very large naval presence in that area, because the last time they did that, they lost the Moskva frigate to a couple of Neptune missiles. So that's largely kept them out, but they're able to wield a credible threat.
The only thing I'd add to that, actually, because I just realised, I mean, you can feel the evidence of the blockade, the inability to export and harvest. You can see it here. I mean, I suppose on the battlefield it's a bit different. It's more to do with kind of, the difficulties of actually operating an agricultural industry under fire. But I was in a farm basically on the front the other day with stacks, a warehouse full of sunflower seeds and a warehouse full of grain, just sitting there beginning to rot. So it is It is. I mean, it's not just a story that you see with the. I find this about kind of export stories. X million tons of whatever. I mean, it is happening. All this stuff is stacking up and not getting out, and it is going to be a big issue for Ukraine, actually.
Thanks, Roland, and thanks, Dom, for commenting on that. Just a couple more things I think we should talk about before we sum up. Louis Ashworth, I know you wanted to talk about the strength of the ruble. What's happening there?
Well, this is actually on the news side of economics here. We've had this morning the Central Bank of Russia has cut interest rates by 3 percentage points, so down from 14% to 11%. This is basically I'm sure you remember at the beginning of the conflict, David, there was in reaction to the initial Western sanctions, the ruble took a complete dive. So the ruble before the invasion of Ukraine, a single US dollar would get you about 75 rubles. Within about a week after the conflict started, it was about 140 rubles, so roughly a sort of 50% drop. It then rapidly came back in the coming weeks, and this was sort of noted, the ruble's recovered very quickly. It didn't stop then. It's kept going. It's continued getting stronger, and we're at a point now where it's about, you get about 63-ish rubles. It's varied a bit over the last couple of days for a dollar. And what we're seeing here from the Central Bank of Russia, by acting to cut interest rates, what you do when a central bank cuts interest rates, it tends to reduce the value of its domestic currency because it makes it less lucrative for investors to hold that currency. It's not generating as much interest passively. It weakens the currency. So what we're seeing here from the Central Bank of Russia is an action to try and take some of the heat out of that ruble rally. And this is quite an interesting sort of dynamic going on here because when the ruble first recovered, its recovery was seen as a sign of Russian resilience. It was seen as a sign that Fortress Russia, because of this export power it has, was able to sort of shield itself and regather itself despite the sort of unprecedented financial onslaught that the West unleashed against Russia. The trouble is, if it keeps going up, it starts to create new problems for Russia. So one of the reasons that it's going up is Russia has always been a country, in recent years has been a country that has had a very steady fiscal arrangements. It's run budget surpluses regularly. It's very fiscally conservative. And it's been able to do that because it's always had a very strong trade surplus, which is because it sells so much oil and gas to the rest of the world. Now, if you can think about what we've seen happen since the start of the conflict, that trade dynamic has been turned up a whole other notch because Russia's energy exports are worth huge amounts because of the rise in energy prices that we've seen, while at the same time imports are plunging because nobody wants to sell anything to the Russians anymore. I mean, one of the most, as much as we can talk about sort of Western government sanctions, about asset freezing, about oligarchs, one of the most meaningful sanctions that's been leveled against Russia is not from a government. It's from shipping companies deciding that they didn't want the reputational damage of shipping things to Russia. So big companies like Maersk, for instance. That has had a profound effect. That has hugely knocked imports into Russia. And as much as we talk about Russia as this resilient, self-reliant economy, they need shipments from the West for all kinds of things like, if ranging right from some kinds of technology and machinery through to things like luxury goods that they used to bring in. So as a result of that boom in exports and the fall in imports, you've actually seen Russia's trade surplus. I believe it's 58 billion in the first quarter, which is the highest in a long time. I think at least 2 decades. And what that serves to do is strengthen the ruble hugely. And the trouble is, when you're an exporting nation, is you normally want your currency to be weaker, so that when you bring in foreign currency for what you're selling, it's more lucrative at home. You can do more with the money at home. It buys you more domestically. That dynamic has become obviously bad for Russia because the ruble is so strong. And so it's creating a difficult dynamic and a sort of conundrum for the Kremlin, because on the one hand, they have this sort of symbolic victory. They have ruble strength. It's something that if you're Vladimir Putin, it's a very easy thing to say to the population is, look how well the ruble's doing. Aren't we doing fantastically? Our economy is strong. But actually, it's going to cause problems for their economy. It's going to weaken them. And on top of that, the benefits that you normally have of a strong ruble for sort of your everyday Russian, which might be, their money goes a bit further if they're buying things from abroad, that effect is much less beneficial if nobody's selling you anything. It's all very well having a ruble that's at its strongest point in half a decade, but if you can't actually buy anything with that because no one will sell you anything, it becomes a lot less beneficial. So it's an interesting dynamic. We've seen the Central Bank of Russia actually, so that the meeting it had today to cut interest rates was brought forward by 2 weeks. So it shows they're working on something of an emergency footing here. And also Moscow has tried to reel in some of the capital controls that it introduced early on in the conflict. All of this is an effort to try and take out some of that heat from under the ruble. The question is whether they're going to be able to maintain that, because they have a certain amount of ammunition, but there's no reason to believe that anytime soon that trade problem is going to go away. So this could become a long-running issue for Vladimir Putin if the ruble is sort of boiling over for the foreseeable months.
Thank you very much, Louis. Just one more thing I think we should talk about briefly before we sum up. Can we discuss this decree that Vladimir Putin has signed, which simplifies the process for residents of Kherson and Zaporizhia, both occupied? The decree simplifies the process to acquire Russian citizenship and get passports, and people think it marks a further step towards the Russification of the two regions. Dom and Roland, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Roland would know better than I, but I think this is a logical extension of what we've seen already in since 2014. They've tried to roll this out in Luhansk and Donetsk. I'm not sure of the statistics about how popular it's been, but it just ties into this narrative that actually the whole thing all along was there to liberate, Putin's words, liberate the Russian-speaking people from the yoke of the Ukrainian Nazis and drug dealers. So unsurprising. I don't know how many people will take it up. I don't know how many people will be able to take it up of their own free will, or with their own free will say no thank you. And as I say, it's a continuation of a process that started in the Donbass in 2014, but I'm sure Roland will be able to expand more.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, passportization, use of rubles, Russian television. I mean, look, this war from the get-go has been a war of conquest. Let's just lay aside all this stuff about NATO security concerns and blah, blah, blah. And maybe in the heads of people like Vladimir Putin, all that stuff is basically different sides of the same coin. But strip it back. The reality is this is a war of imperial conquest. The idea was to conquer Ukraine, and that's what he's doing. He's going to annex those areas. De facto, he's going to annex it. Whether it becomes part of Russia, it looks like it probably will, I think, or he institutes more kind of so-called republics. I don't know, but that's the game, and that it has implications for the future of the war as well, because the Russians are digging in on that southern front. We haven't heard much about the southern front, but it's quiet. The Russians are digging in to stay, and rooting them out is going to be difficult if the Ukrainians ever kind of manage to get round to that. But yeah, I mean, I broadly agree with Dom. I mean, it doesn't surprise me whatsoever, and I'd expect to see it in any land the Russians can kind of take and hold. And I'm sure if they had succeeded in taking Kiev or Kharkiv earlier in the war, we'd have seen a similar thing on a much grander scale.
Well, thank you, Roland and Dom. So I think we've probably got to the end of our time here. So Louis and Dom, can I have your final thoughts? And then Roland, would you like to take we'll have you last. We'll have you live from the Donbass to wrap up the episode. So Louis and Dom first. What should our audience be thinking about in the next few days?
Well, it's going to be interesting to continue to see the fallout from the food crisis. I wouldn't be surprised if we are seeing more actions in the coming days and weeks in the region of export bans, export controls, countries attempting to sort of shore up their own domestic food supplies, and that's going to be something that the world will push back against, and there will be a lot of opposition to that. But it's going to be a very hard move to resist, because ultimately, governments first and foremost care about domestic issues, and the consequences of that are going to be very, very severe for those countries that are less less able to be self-sufficient on food. So we'll see how that develops. It's been a really hot topic at Davos, food security and the sort of food crisis that we're seeing. David Malpass, head of the World Bank, is giving a speech on it this afternoon, so it'll be interesting to see as well what he says, because obviously he'll take a very interesting global perspective, I'm sure, on the sort of issues that are emerging there. So I think that issue is just beginning to unfold, really.
And for me, I think it's worth keeping an eye on the fallout that's still carrying on from Kissinger's comments and from that the opinion piece in the New York Times earlier in the week talking about Ukraine must get real and accept it's got to give up territory for peace. These ideas, basically, that Kissinger's view there is that's just old, outdated, outmoded, just doesn't bear any relation to the modern world where values have been so egregiously assaulted. And I was actually just before this podcast, I was speaking to Kusti Salm, who's the Estonian Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Defence, about these very issues. He was very, very punchy, and he was saying that there is no. We were talking about what a win means for Ukraine and whether a win for Ukraine is the same as a defeat for Russia, or if there's something subtly different in there. But he was basically saying that for Ukraine, there is no. It's got to be about territory. The economy's been destroyed, the infrastructure's been destroyed. A quarter of the population have been uprooted and have had to flee the country. So he said there's only a military outcome. That is the only win Ukraine can go for. Just a military outcome, which I thought was quite punchy. And he also said that NATO, in the NATO meeting in June, in Madrid, the 29th, 30th of June in Madrid, NATO has got to take this decision to move from a posture of deterrence by punishment to deterrence by denial. And what it means is deterrence by punishment, having a light force along the border and saying to Russia, basically, don't step over that. If you invade us, there will be consequences. He said that's no good. You don't want to be invaded and then start talking about getting pushing them out. He said you need to move to a posture of deterrence by denial, whereby they are so convinced that it would not be worth their weight, worth invading, that they don't do it. And he said to do that, we need to massively upgun the whole place. And he was talking about Estonia hosting a new NATO land force headquarters, divisional size headquarters to Estonia to host. Britain got a lot of troops in Estonia at the moment. He didn't go as far as to saying he'd wish them to stay, but he would be reluctant to see them go. I think it was as strong as he'd get. But I thought it was very interesting that Estonia now offering to host a new NATO land headquarters. But I'll hopefully get some more time tomorrow to talk about the view from Estonia. But no, a great chat there with Mr. Salm.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you, Dom. Roland, would you like the final words?
I think you've got to be watching what's happening in Donbass. All of this stuff that that Dom was talking about, and that we've been talking about sentiment, money, the kind of international opinion. Should the Ukrainians get real? Like ceasefires, peace, it's always decided on the battlefield. Which is why when you hear people saying, kind of wringing their hands and saying, "Oh, we just need to talk things through," well, no, you talk on the battlefield. And what you do is you kill as many of the other person as possible until they can't fight, or you've both exhausted yourselves, and then the talks take place. I mean, that's what happened here. I watched it happen in 2014. The Russians inflicted a devastating defeat on the Ukrainians, and then they dictated the peace terms, which was the Minsk peace agreement, which, long story, and now here we are today. That's what's going on here. If this battle goes the Russians' way, the Russians will be hoping that it puts them in a much better position to get to these eventual talks, and that opinion in the West and amongst Ukraine's allies will be moved by that, and the Ukrainians are hoping to inflict as much attrition on the Russians as possible in the process, in order to resist that. And then eventually, and there is talk around here of the great coming summer counteroffensive. Possible? Will it happen? That's the narrative that we're waiting for. So I just don't think we can expect the fighting to be done anytime soon. It's going to run throughout the year. But both sides have a lot invested in the impression that their battlefield success is making on other countries and on the world. And I mean, it's a little bit hackneyed, I suppose, but it just means more destruction and frankly, more artillery flying around and more more people in pieces, quite honestly.